Okay, so we are going to continue our journey through the medieval period and enter the world of Geoffrey Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, and the late 14th century. And in this video, I'm going to go over the historical context, the historical background, and move into Chaucer as an author and give you the kind of background for the Canterbury Tales. And then we'll move into talking about the general prologue. So bear with me, and we will begin our discussion on um, uh, we will begin with where we left off in our last historical context video with the Norman invasion and the results of it. So as a result of the Norman invasion, we have this kind of time of tremendous social, political, and economic change in England. And I'm going to talk about each of these individually and how they help us get to where we are with Chaucer's portrait of English society. So as a result of the Norman conquest of 1066, of course, we talked about how it's an end to the Anglo-Saxons in England and the rise of French culture and language. But the Norman invasion has huge political and social consequences. And what happens is all of the nobility in England is now French, and all of the Anglo-Saxons become part of the peasantry, because that's what happens when people win wars, right? So anyways, there are huge political and social consequences because of the Norman invasion. Broadly speaking, the medieval society can be broken down into three main categories, or the three estates. And this is important for when we begin talking about the Canterbury Tales. We have the aristocracy, or the ruling class, the clergy, or the church, and then everyone else who makes up about 90% of society is the peasantry. And what we have here over the course of about 300 years is this balance of power subtly shifting away from the aristocracy and the church and towards the peasantry. And one of William the Conqueror, or King William as he later becomes, and his claim to fame is the Domesday Book, not to be confused with Doomsday. The Domesday Book, which is essentially the first inventory of British property. And if you take the time to read this very fascinating book, you'll notice that all of the people who have landed property have French Norman names, and everyone who has less value or less property have Saxon names, but that's besides the point. So William sends people to scour the countryside, counting everything, every building down to every chicken and cow and piece of wheat in the field. And this allows him to collect property taxes. And the more someone owns, the more taxes he or she pays, which consequently means that the more work the serfs and the peasants have to do. So it's this kind of imbalanced sense of power. So the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. Enter someone like, Robin Hood. Another result of the Norman invasion or the Norman conquest is feudalism. And I'm grossly oversimplifying a lot of these kind of historical concepts and historical terms just for the sake of ease and just for the sake of ease. So feudalism is brought over by the Normans from France, and it's this comprehensive hierarchical system of social, political, and economic relationships. It's a top-down system of power with little to no chance of social mobility, especially if you're a peasant. So here on top is God, and God sees fit to pick a king, and then the nobility with the knights and the peasants. So really, the closer you are to the top, the closer you are to God, and therefore the more power you have. And what makes this system work is the code of chivalry, that loyalty of the knights and nobility to a king. And we've seen those kinds of values because in our last unit, because the primary obligation of this middle chunk here, the middle levels, was the military, and the knight becomes, under this under the system of feudalism, the knight becomes a symbol of these ideals of loyalty. It's at the center of these social codes and social behaviors. And when one breaks those social contracts or those social conventions, there's not only a personal risk, but there's also the risk to the fabric of society. And this kind of goes back to that Anglo-Saxon idea of comitatus, where you have loyalty and honor to a lord. So the codes of chivalry keep this kind of feudalistic system alive and prosperous. Another result of the Norman invasion is, I don't know if it's really a result of, but another political development during this time that has a huge impact on the social fabric is the Crusades, which is roughly 3.5 centuries of holy wars to claim the city of Jerusalem that begins after the Norman invasion and ends after Chaucer's death in 1400. And ultimately, although it ultimately proves to be unfruitful, these crusades, this expansion east, has a tremendous impact on society because it helps create cities. And as Europeans move, or it changes the focal point of medieval society to the cities. And as Europeans move east, they made contact with Arabic cultures that establish trade, and they bring back consumer goods and new forms of knowledge that help cosmopolitan areas grow and further weaken feudalism by offering an alternative to that kind of social system, which is the trade system, the trade network, and cities become this hub of trade. And it also gives rise to, as these soldiers and these traders return from the east with teas and spices and fabrics and all these, new and rich consumer goods that people want to buy, there is this new class that emerges, and that's the merchant class, and they can construct these guilds that of like-minded people with like-minded goals that have tremendous political and social pull. Also, as a result of the contact with the Middle East through the Crusades, is that it exposes Europeans to advances in sciences, mathematics, and architecture. And as a result of that, these cities become centers of learning. And in the 13th century, London sees the founding of its two most influential universities, Oxford and Cambridge. I'm an Oxford girl. Oxford and Cambridge. And these secular institutions offer a challenge to the traditional institutions of learning or the Christian monasteries. So education becomes not something just for the aristocracy, not just for people who intend to go into the church, but it opens education up to the other people, the other 90% of society, particularly the merchant and the middle class, the rising merchant and middle classes. So we have these changes in learning, and more people are being educated, and consequently, this causes changes in the church. Okay, so before I go into my next slide about these significant changes in the church, there's something that you have to understand. And the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages had huge power over people's lives. And I mean, who's the figurehead of the Catholic Church? The Pope, right? And the Pope claims this kind of authority over all of the kings and all of the clergy. And what happens in, I want to say 1165, 1164, I have to double check, but there is this dispute between the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is Thomas à Becket, and King Henry II. And the Archbishop of Canterbury is kind of the highest position, the most powerful bishop in all of England. It's the strongest tie to the Catholic Church. So it's an incredible position of power. And you have King Henry II, who is a pretty powerful king. And what they have is this kind of power dispute on who has the authority over England, over the monarchy, and over the church. And Henry says, it's me because I'm the king. And Thomas à Becket says, no, it's the Pope because he's the closest to God because of that whole hierarchical system. So anyways, there's this dispute with King Henry over how much power the church had. And Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most powerful church figure in England, his loyalty is to the Pope and not to the king. And really what Henry wants to do is put this limit, wants to limit the amount of power, the political power the church has. And so there's a lot of bad blood between the king and Thomas à Becket. And essentially there's rumors that go around that Henry said, will someone rid me of this meddlesome priest? And two people go out and murder Thomas à Becket. And his assassination does two things. And really his murder generates tremendous amount of sympathy for the Catholic Church. And so it solidifies and renews the cultural power of the church across England. Henry loses favor. And the other thing that happens as a result of this is that it allows members of the clergy to take these unprecedented liberties, leading to corruption at every level of the church. And this has tremendous impact into the Renaissance and the Reformation, and it all begins here. So there's these changes in the church. Another significant change that happens because of the growth of cities is, you guessed it, the Black Plague. And essentially because there's this overpopulation of people in cities, people are incredibly unclean, and rats and fleas and all, you know how the Black Plague starts. There's a year where over 40% of the population dies. It's killed off. And because there is this loss in the population, there's also a labor shortage. And because of that labor shortage, the working class gains power, considerable power, over their overlords. And they have the peasant rebellion, and ultimately there's this kind of emancipation of the serfs. And that is another nail into that's another hit to feudalism, and another move toward a democratic society. Another result of the growth of the cities and secular institutions is the development and the signing of the Magna Carta. And it's essentially a document that guarantees all citizens the right to a trial by jury. It becomes this basis of English constitutional law and the development of the British legal system. So in other words, the Magna Carta guarantees the rights of all British citizens, and it leads to the development of the legal profession. So we have this new profession of lawyers, and we'll see a man of law in the Canterbury Tales, and this further weakens feudalism. But the final blow, the final nail in the coffin of feudalism, is the 100 Years' War. And although it was, fought over 116, who's counting, 100 years is close enough, where England fights the French for these two territories. And there we go. Okay. Y'all know I can't spell. All right. English fights the French for these territories, and this is important and impactful because who are the Normans, right? They were French, but now they're fighting against the French. They don't see themselves as being this kind of Anglo-Norman people. There's this new sense of British identity. And with the 100 Years' War, there is a new kind of figure in society called the yeoman. And the yeoman, I can find my notes, becomes this symbol of the 100 Years' War. And he's always depicted with these long bow arrows that can, he's more efficient and more effective in battle than the traditional knight figure. The yeoman is this independent farmer who fights for his own interests rather than a knight who fights for a landowner. And this figure of the yeoman, the everyday man, the every man who fights for his own interests, replaces the image of the knight. And essentially, this right here is what kills feudalism and allows for the rise of a new middle class. And the importance of this is that, for the reasons that we've already talked about, but the rise of the middle class is the basis of a new language in England. It is the closest thing. It's Middle English. It's not quite modern English yet, but it is the language that, you could look at something in Middle English and recognize it for it being your own language. And this is significant because it means that not only is it a new evolution of language, which I'm going to give a video on separately. But it also ensures that literacy is no longer for the aristocracy and the clergy. It is something for others. So from here, I'm going to stop this here, and I'm going to pick up and I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background on Geoffrey Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales itself, and then move into kind of an overview of the general prologue. So stay tuned.